Welcome to RealTime Affairs. Welcome back to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. We take stacks of sources and pull out the key insights for you. Tonight we're embarking on a calm, thoughtful exploration of a really significant day in American history, the 4th of July. Our mission is to gently peel back the layers of this familiar holiday. Move beyond just the fireworks and barbecues. We want to understand its true historical significance, the profound ideals it represents, and importantly, how its meaning has evolved, and how it continues to evolve, especially when we consider the voices of those often overlooked in the main narrative. We'll delve into some surprising facts, early predictions, its global impact, all designed to offer you a comprehensive yet soothing understanding as we navigate this rich history together.
That's right. We're going to really lean into the complexities and nuances of this pivotal moment, exploring the journey toward independence, not as, a single dramatic event, but as a series of deliberate, often quite challenging steps. We'll discover that the path to the Declaration wasn't some unanimous dash for freedom right from the start. It was much more gradual and, at times, even a reluctant shift in the colonial mindset.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting right at the very beginning. That journey toward independence.
It's easy to think of the colonies as, a single unified group just clamoring for freedom from day one, right? Like a spontaneous uprising. But our sources indicate a much more cautious reality, especially at first. In early 1775, when those first Revolutionary War battles broke out, very few colonists actually desired a complete separation from Great Britain. You have to imagine for a moment that you were a colonist then. You were a British subject, deeply tied by culture, economy, tradition, everything, to the crown. The idea of completely severing those ties. For many, it was almost unthinkable. It felt like treason. So this wasn't a sudden leap. It was gradual, often hesitant, driven by escalating tensions and, a growing sense of injustice.
And what's truly striking here is how quickly that reluctance began to change, almost in spite of those initial feelings. As hostility grew, fueled by various British policies, a really decisive moment came in August 1775. King George III formally declared the colonists in his date of open and avowed rebellion. Now, this wasn't just a political statement, it was a profound psychological blow, and a legal one too. By labeling them rebels, the king basically removed any pretense of reconciliation. He signaled a full commitment to military suppression. And that act pushed many moderate colonists, the ones who'd hoped for maybe a negotiated settlement, towards a much more radical solution: complete independence. The very possibility of remaining loyal subjects while being treated as enemies just became untenable for more and more people.
And then the intellectual ammunition arrived, didn't it? Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. Published in early 1776, it really lit a fire under this previously, almost unthinkable idea. It wasn't just another political tract, it was a phenomenon. Paine's genius was stripping away the complex arguments and speaking directly to the common person, in language they understood. He didn't just advocate for independence, he framed it as a moral imperative, a natural right, an inevitable destiny, almost. He systematically dismantled the arguments for monarchy, especially the idea of divine right, and presented self-governance as clear, logical, and achievable. Within months, over 120,000 copies were circulating. That's a staggering number for the time, equivalent to tens of millions today. It was read aloud in taverns, meeting houses, military camps. It transformed a radical notion into widespread public discussion. It convinced countless Americans that independence wasn't just necessary, but achievable and morally just.
Exactly. And this shift in public sentiment was absolutely critical. It directly influenced the actions of the Continental Congress. They'd been meeting in Philadelphia since 1775, remember? And initially, their sessions operated under strict rules of secrecy. It was a necessity, really, for survival. To openly debate independence was to invite charges of treason, punishable by death. But by June 7, 1776, the momentum was undeniable. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced that pivotal resolution, stating unequivocally that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. This wasn't just a proposal, it was the formal legislative step. It pushed the idea from a growing feeling into a concrete, actionable demand.
So following Lee's bold resolution, they appointed a committee of 5. Their job was to draft a formal statement, a declaration, basically. Something that would explain this huge decision to a skeptical world and, importantly, to the American people themselves. This committee was, a carefully chosen group. A blend of the era's most prominent figures, reflecting the diverse perspectives needed. You had Thomas Jefferson, known for his elegant writing, the fiery John Adams, a tireless independence advocate, Benjamin Franklin, the pragmatic statesman, diplomat, unparalleled experience, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, a skilled lawyer and politician, and Robert R. Livingston from New York. Jefferson, because of his writing ability, got the job of drafting the initial document. He later explained he wasn't striving for originality of principle or sentiment. He wasn't trying to be wholly original. Instead, he aimed for an expression of the American mind, drawing freely from existing documents like George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, and incorporating accepted Enlightenment ideals, like John Locke's philosophy of natural rights, which were already kind of swirling in the intellectual air at the time.
And that wasn't a weakness. He's drawing on existing ideas. It was actually profound strategic genius. The power of his draft lay in its ability to synthesize these widely held philosophies into a revolutionary yet somehow familiar framework. By articulating ideas already circulating, he made independence seem palatable, intellectually justifiable to a diverse colonial population. It turned abstract philosophical concepts into a powerful, accessible rallying cry for self-governance. However, this raises an important question. What happened to that initial draft, the one penned with such care? We often think of the Declaration as this perfect singular document, but it actually went through significant changes. Congress, as Jefferson famously put it, mangled his composition. They cut and changed a lot of his carefully chosen wording.
And one of the most significant omissions, one that really stands out, was his vigorous denunciation of King George III regarding the slave trade. Jefferson had written this really scathing passage condemning the king for perpetuating a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery. It was a powerful moral indictment, but it proved too contentious for the Congress. Southern delegates whose economies were deeply reliant on enslaved labor, and some northern merchants involved in the trade, insisted it be removed.
Right. And Jefferson, though deeply displeased, he recognized that unity among the colonies was paramount, absolutely essential for the war effort. Including that clause would have fractured the fragile coalition. So he reluctantly agreed to a solution. It's a stark illustration of the compromises made to achieve independence, isn't it? And a painful foreshadowing of the nation's future struggles with this deep contradiction.
So if we look at the precise timeline then, the Continental Congress officially voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776. That was the actual legal separation moment. John Adams, writing to his wife Abigail the very next day, July 3rd, was absolutely convinced of the significance of that vote. He declared, "I am apt to believe that July 2nd, 1776 will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival." He went on to predict, with remarkable prescience really, that it would be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore.
Yeah.
He got the date wrong, of course.
He did, just by 2 days. Which is a fascinating historical footnote, isn't it? How even brilliant minds can be slightly off when predicting the future. But his vision for the celebrations was uncannily accurate. He nailed that part.
Indeed. So while the resolution passed on July 2nd, it was on July 4th that Congress formally adopted the text of the Declaration of Independence after all those revisions. And that was the date printers put on the broadside announcements, those public notices printed on big sheets of paper sent out across the colonies. This act of publicizing the document with the July 4th date firmly cemented that day in the public's mind as Independence Day. And here's another common belief we should probably debunk. Contrary to popular belief, nobody actually signed the Declaration on July 4, 1776.
That's absolutely right. The signing began nearly a month later, on August 2nd. John Hancock's famous bold signature came first, apparently so King George could read it without his spectacles, though that might be legend too. But the process of gathering all 56 signatures was protracted. It wasn't completed until late November. It was a gradual, deliberate process, not a single dramatic moment like you see in paintings.
Right, not like the famous Trumbull painting suggests. And connecting this to the bigger picture, the Declaration itself lays out some truly profound ideals. Ideals that would define the American experiment, even if, well, imperfectly applied at the time. It begins with those incredibly resonant words. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
Those phrases became the bedrock of American identity, didn't they? Representing fundamental human rights inherent, can't be taken away. This was a truly revolutionary concept for the era. It challenged centuries of social hierarchy, inherited status, by asserting that every individual possessed fundamental worth and rights simply by virtue of being human.
And beyond those famous words, the Declaration also articulated that really radical principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. This fundamentally shifted the whole concept of political legitimacy, away from divine right or inherited power, which was the norm in Europe, towards the will of the people themselves.
It was an assertion of popular sovereignty. Governments only have legitimate authority if it's granted by the people they govern. And it further asserts that it's the right, even the duty of the people, to alter or abolish any government that becomes destructive of these ends. So if a government fails to protect these rights, the people can change it or overthrow it.
And to prove their case for breaking away, the document then listed those 27 specific grievances against King George III.
Exactly. And what's striking is that these grievances effectively served as a meticulous legal brief for revolution, a detailed indictment. They weren't just vague complaints. They were carefully selected charges designed to show a pattern of tyranny, building the argument for separation. These included, for example, complaints about taxation without consent, that core grievance, no taxation without representation.
Which later got enshrined in the Constitution.
Right, requiring tax laws to originate in the House. They also listed maintaining standing armies in peacetime without legislative approval. That grievance contributed to the Fourth Amendment, prohibiting the pouring of soldiers without consent.
And then there's that really troubling one.
Yes, the one about inciting domestic insurrections and bringing on the merciless Indian savages, as they put it. That deeply disturbing phrase reflected the biases and fears prevalent among some colonists. It was used to further justify the break, painting the king as an instigator of barbarity. And it contributed to a narrative that unfortunately led to centuries of conflict and displacement for Indigenous peoples. These specific charges show the detailed legal and moral argument they were making.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly now and dive into the fascinating world of 4th of July folklore. This is where cherished beliefs often meet surprising historical truths. Our deep dive now takes us into some of the most enduring, yet often mistaken tales surrounding this day.
Let's start with a real classic. Many people believe the iconic Liberty Bell cracked when it was rung enthusiastically on July 4th, 1776, to celebrate independence. It's a powerful image, deeply ingrained, isn't it? A symbol of joyful, spontaneous freedom. However, the State House bell, as it was actually known then, likely didn't ring at all that day.
Not at all.
Probably not. Historians generally agree it likely rang on July 8th for the first public readings of the Declaration, along with other city bells. And the famous crack itself, well, the bell was poorly cast in England and actually cracked soon after it arrived in Philadelphia in 1752, decades before the Revolution.
Wow, okay.
It was then recast in Philadelphia, cracked again, repaired, recracked several times. Today's iconic crack appeared sometime in the 19th century, not during the celebrations of 76. And what's really striking here is the name Liberty Bell. That wasn't contemporary to the Revolution either. It was coined by abolitionists in the 1830s. They repurposed its symbolism for their fight against slavery, making it a powerful emblem of freedom for all people, which is fascinating in itself.
That is fascinating. Okay, next myth. The enduring image of Paul Revere riding solo through the night, warning, "The British are coming." It's almost cinematic, but again, maybe not the full picture.
That's a powerful image, absolutely, but not entirely accurate. Paul Revere was indeed a vital part of what you could call a low-tech but highly effective early warning system. This was on the night of April 18, 1775. He was tasked with alerting the countryside that British troops were moving towards Lexington and Concord. But he wasn't alone. He was part of a network. William Dawes rode a different, longer route, and they were joined by a third rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott, a local physician who knew the roads really well.
Oh, a whole team, essentially.
Pretty much. And Revere and Dawes were actually captured by a British patrol shortly after reaching Lexington. They never made it to Concord. Only Prescott, using his local knowledge and managing to escape, got all the way to Concord with the critical warning.
So the famous poem.
Right. The romanticized version of the Lone Rider was largely a deliberate myth-making effort by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his famous 19th century poem, Paul Revere's Ride. He published it in 1861, right on the eve of the Civil War. He specifically wrote it to stoke patriotism and unity in the North, using a past hero to inspire resolve. And it worked. It became an instant classic.
Shaped how generations saw it. Okay, another popular notion, that all American men just eagerly flocked to fight for freedom as soon as the revolution began, driven purely by unified patriotism. Again, a compelling image, but maybe too simple.
Yes. While there was certainly an initial rush of enthusiasm right at the start, in 1775, our sources indicate that this widespread zeal waned considerably as the struggle became long, hard, and really brutal. Many American men were farmers. Their concerns for their livelihoods, their crops, their farms, their families grew as the war dragged on. They needed to plant and harvest. After those initial enlistment rushes faded, maintaining a standing army became a persistent challenge for the Continental Congress. Some colonies resorted to offering pretty substantial cash incentives bonuses as early as 1776 to encourage enlistment. And by the end of 1778, states were actively drafting men into service, sometimes using lotteries, just to meet troop quotas.
So not quite the volunteer army image we sometimes have?
Not consistently, no. And this stands in stark contrast to the professional British Army, which had a reliable force, plus those roughly 30,000 German auxiliary troops, the Hessians. And the use of those mercenaries actually fueled colonial anger. It was even listed as a grievance in the Declaration itself, a king using foreign soldiers against his own subjects.
And perhaps most surprisingly, the idea that America was completely united against the British, a monolithic front of patriots.
That's another really common misconception that simplifies a deeply fractured reality. The Revolutionary War was, in many ways, also a bitter civil war within the British Empire. Our sources suggest perhaps 15 to 20% of all Americans were loyalists. They actively supported the British crown.
That's a significant chunk.
It really is. These often included government officials, wealthy merchants with strong ties to Britain, Anglican clergy, many recent immigrants. Historical records are patchy, but it's estimated maybe 50,000 Americans served as British soldiers or in loyalist militias at various times. That's a significant force against the Continental Army that often numbered only about 20,000 at any given time, though over 100,000 served throughout the war overall. And beyond that, many others just tried to stay out of the conflict altogether. Prioritizing safety, livelihood, it was deeply divisive, pitting neighbor against neighbor, even splitting families.
Right. And related to that, the idea that all Native Americans uniformly sided with the British, painted as a single hostile enemy, like that phrase in the Declaration hints at.
This is such a crucial point, and it needs a much more nuanced understanding, especially given that problematic language in the Declaration. While it's true many Native American groups did eventually ally with the British, they often did so seeing them as maybe the lesser of two evils, or as a way to protect their lands from relentless colonial expansion. But many other indigenous nations actually sided with the American colonists, and a significant number just tried to stay neutral, seeing it as a European conflict that would harm them regardless of the outcome.
So divisions there too.
Absolutely. Most New England Indians, like the Oneida and Tuscarora within the Iroquois Confederacy, actually supported the Continentals. They formed crucial alliances, while other Iroquois nations, like the Mohawk and Seneca, allied with the British. The powerful Iroquois Confederacy itself was tragically split by the war. When Native groups fought with the British, it was primarily about trying to save their homelands from colonial encroachment, a threat they feared would continue no matter who won.
And sadly, those fears were often realized.
Yes. Both British allied and American allied Native groups often fared poorly in the long run, frequently losing land and sovereignty after the war, regardless of who they supported. It underscores that indigenous peoples were diverse nations making strategic choices in incredibly perilous times.
Okay, finally, the thrilling movie plot. Secret messages hidden on the back of the Declaration of Independence, like national treasure.
Huh? Yes, a captivating thought, isn't it? But pure Hollywood fantasy. The National Archives, which safeguards the actual document, confirms there is something written on the back. But it's much less dramatic. It simply says, Original Declaration of Independence dated 4th July, 1776.
Just a label.
Exactly, just a practical label. Common practice for large, important documents back then. They'd roll them up for travel and storage, and a label on the back made it easy to identify without unrolling. So no hidden maps, no cryptic codes, just good old-fashioned archival practice.
All right, and one final, poignant yet remarkable historical coincidence. The idea that John Adams died thinking of Thomas Jefferson. That poetic image of the two rivals turned friends passing each other.
It is an incredible, almost unbelievable fact that both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did die on the very same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration's adoption. The synchronicity feels almost too perfect to be true.
It really does.
However, our sources tell us there's no real solid evidence Adams actually uttered the famous last words, Jefferson survives, on his deathbed. In a truly bittersweet twist, Jefferson had actually passed away several hours earlier that same day down at Monticello. So the statement, if made, would have been tragically incorrect.
Wow. And James Monroe, too.
Yes, another layer to this strange coincidence. James Monroe, another founding father president, though not a Declaration signer, also died on July 4th, but in 1831. And interestingly, the only U.S. president born on Independence Day was Calvin Coolidge, July 4th, 1872. It's a remarkable series of coincidences that adds to the mystique of the date.
It certainly does. It reminds you of the profound historical ties these figures shared.
Absolutely. And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, these historical nuances, these debunks myths, they lead us to a deeper, more complex understanding of the 4th. It's a day for both celebration and really critical reflection, especially when we consider voices that highlight that gap, sometimes a chasm between the Declaration's soaring ideals and the often harsh reality of the nation. This raises that important question. What did this day truly mean to those whose freedom was denied, even as others celebrated? How did marginalized groups experience this declared independence?
And that's precisely where the powerful, searing words of Frederick Douglass come in, illuminating this profound disparity like few others could. Born into slavery around 1818, Douglass escaped to freedom, became this brilliant, powerful leader of the abolitionist movement, a beacon of justice and eloquence. On July 5, 1852, in Rochester, New York, he delivered one of his most famous speeches. What to the slave is your 4th of July? He spoke to an audience of about 600 people, and the timing, July 5th, was absolutely deliberate.
It was. Delivering it the day after the national celebration created this immediate jarring contrast between the joyous festivities and the brutal reality of slavery. Douglass began his address strategically by acknowledging respect for the founders. He called them brave and great men who gave frame to a great age, contended for great principles. He even said he would unite with you to honor their memory. But this initial conciliatory tone shifted very quickly. He turned to challenge the audience directly, laying bare the hypocrisy. He asked them with piercing directness, "Why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice, embodied in that Declaration of Independence, extended to us?" It was just a direct, uncomfortable question, cutting right to the core.
Forcing them to confront that contradiction. His words laid bare the hypocrisy, the stark divide. He declared unequivocally, "I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us." Quote, "The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me." He positioned himself and all enslaved people completely outside the concept of American independence being celebrated, highlighting its exclusivity, its painful irony.
And he drove the point home with such vivid, visceral imagery, designed not just to inform, but really to shock the audience into understanding the brutal reality. He asserted, "The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." He called the celebration a sham, the boasted liberty an unholy license, the sounds of rejoicing empty and heartless. Their shouts of liberty and equality were hollow mockery, he said, just a thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. And in one of his most powerful lines, "There is not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour." Strong words.
Incredibly strong. And he didn't mince words about what was needed either. He wasn't calling for gentle persuasion. He advocated for strong, uncompromising condemnation of slavery. He famously said, "For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake." He believed the nation's feeling, conscience, propriety, hypocrisy, all needed to be startled, exposed, its crimes proclaimed and denounced. Only a dramatic intervention could shake the nation from its complacency.
And what's truly fascinating is how Douglass's message still resonates today, why that speech remains so famous. As historian David Blight explains, Douglass masterfully used the 4th for its profound irony, consistently highlighting how America struggled to live up to its own founding goals. For Douglass, race was always the true measure of America's progress towards those promises. He continued using July 5th in later years, even after emancipation, to draw attention to the nation's track record, asking in 1875, for instance, if war among the whites brought peace and liberty to the blacks, what will peace among the whites bring?
Wow. Always pushing, always holding America accountable.
Exactly. A lifelong commitment, reminding us the work of freedom is never really finished.
And this discussion about Douglass naturally expands to the Declaration's initial limitations beyond slavery, too. As some sources point out, when it said, "all men are created equal," it really more specifically meant men, not women, who looked only like those penning the document. tragically leaving Native Americans, people of color behind, but also excluding women entirely. Even Abigail Adams saw this. In March 1776, she famously wrote to John, urging him and the Congress to remember the ladies in the New Wells, warning that if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
A powerful plea, even if largely dismissed at the time. It highlights that the fight for equal representation wasn't limited to one group. It was a pervasive, though often unacknowledged, undercurrent. Women played crucial roles, boycotts, running households and farms, skies, nurses, but those contributions didn't translate into political equality then.
Right, so this makes the 4th of July a day for both, well, celebration and critical reflection, doesn't it? Acknowledging what our sources call those merciless mistakes.
Exactly. The freedom we appreciate today isn't solely thanks to the Founding Fathers, as critical as they were. It's also thanks to everyone who was and is a part of the story, and who carried the Founding Fathers on their shoulders. This perspective encourages a more inclusive, more complete understanding of liberty and equality. It highlights the ongoing struggle, the continuous journey toward a more perfect union. It compels us to consider Indigenous perspectives whose lands were often disregarded, to remember the millions enslaved for whom the 4th was a bitter irony. By integrating these overlooked voices, we don't diminish the Founders' legacy, we enrich it. We get a deeper, more honest, and ultimately, I think, more inspiring understanding of liberty and the work needed to extend its promises to all.
So what does this all mean for how the holiday is observed today? How has it evolved from those early days? Independence Day certainly cemented its place, became a federal holiday in 1870, then a paid federal holiday in 1941, underscoring its national importance, especially after the Civil War, Depression, World War II. Today, it's commonly associated with vibrant displays, gatherings, often a long weekend, one of the big summer occasions.
Yeah, families often celebrate with picnics, barbecues, transforming backyards and parks into festive hubs, taking advantage of the day off. Parades are a beloved tradition in so many towns and cities. Some go on for hours. Floats, local groups, historical marked by raucous gatherings, massive bonfires, especially in New England. Towns would compete to build these towering pyramids of barrels. Some in Salem, Massachusetts, were apparently 40 tiers high, huge bonfires, a dramatic, maybe slightly dangerous precursor to modern fireworks.
40 tiers, wow.
I know. Even today, you see red, white, and blue everywhere. Homes, stores, public spaces. And patriotic songs fill the air. The Star-Spangled Banner, America the Beautiful, often recalling revolutionary images.
And fireworks, arguably the most iconic symbol now, illuminating the sky. And here's where it gets really interesting. That tradition started surprisingly early.
Right back in 1777.
That's right, just 1 year after the Declaration. In Philadelphia, July 4, 1777, the first organized celebration. The Pennsylvania Evening Post reported ship cannons fired a 13-gun salute for the colonies, and there was a grand exhibition of fireworks. And the city was beautifully illuminated. Boston had its own fireworks display that same night, too, set off by the Sons of Liberty. They had a flair for the dramatic.
So the pyrotechnics are almost as old as the nation itself, deeply woven into the very first celebrations. Absolutely. And their widespread use really took off after the War of 1812, another conflict that solidified American identity. As public safety concerns led to cannons and muskets being phased out of celebrations, they were dangerous. Fireworks became an increasingly important and safer alternative, providing that thrill without the risk of live ammo. Today, Americans spend around $1 billion on fireworks each 4th. Huge business, whether it's professional displays or personal use.
$1 billion.
Yeah. Major cities like New York, with the Macy's display exploding over 22 tons of pyrotechnics back in 2009, host these massive public shows. But safety concerns, local fire conditions. They often lead states and regions to ban or limit personal fireworks. That's an ongoing debate, tradition versus safety. A powerful, more solemn tradition that still occurs is the salute to the Union. One gun fired for each state at noon by capable military bases across the country, echoing that original 13-gun salute.
A rolling commemoration. That's neat. And finally, what about globally? What does the 4th of July mean beyond U.S. borders? Does that message of independence resonate elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. Its concepts have had far-reaching influence. Inspired movements for self-determination all over the world. For example, the Philippines celebrates July 4th as its Republic Day, commemorating the day in 1946 when the U.S. officially recognized Philippine independence after nearly 50 years of American rule. Although they initially observed it as their Independence Day, they changed that date in 1962 to June 12th, honoring an earlier declaration from Spanish rule. But that historical link to July 4th remains significant.
Interesting, and in Denmark.
Right. Outside the U.S., the Rebuild National Park in Denmark hosts what's said to be the largest July 4th celebrations anywhere else. It attracts thousands every year. It's this unique tradition dating back to 1912. Serves as a big homecoming for Danish Americans, and it's a testament to shared ideals of freedom and democracy between the two nations.
That's fascinating. Its influence really stretches far, and even in unexpected places, there are subtle nods.
Precisely. Even in Canada, our neighbor with a distinct history, the city of Trois-Rivières, Quebec, celebrates its founding every July 4th. It was established way back on July 4, 1634. And interestingly, it was also the site of the final Revolutionary War battle fought on Quebec soil back in June 1776. A minor skirmish, but historically significant.
A little-known connection.
Yeah. And a really unique symbolic gesture. Gloucester Cathedral in England has rung its bells to the tune of the Star-Spangled Banner on July 4th in recent years. It's honoring its link to John Stafford Smith, the English composer who wrote the melody to an old English song that was later adopted for the U.S. national anthem. These examples really underscore how the spirit of independence, self-determination, it's a universal human aspiration, a flame lit in America that spread its light, influencing constitutions and rights declarations from France to Latin America. It shows that while the 4th is undeniably American, the universal language of liberty it articulated continues to be an enduring beacon, reminding us the struggle for freedom is a shared human journey.
As we gently close this deep dive, we've really journeyed quite a distance, haven't we? From the intense debates and compromises in Philadelphia to the vibrant, colorful, sometimes challenging traditions of today, and even to those global echoes of independence. We've seen how the 4th of July is rooted in these profound ideals: freedom, equality, the pursuit of happiness, yet it's also a day that calls for continuous reflection. Reflection on the ongoing work needed to actually extend those promises to everyone. It's a living history, constantly shaped by new understandings. A reminder that the journey towards a more perfect union is, well, perpetual.
And remember Frederick Douglass's ultimate hope, even amidst his sharpest critique. I do not despair of this country. He saw forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. He drew encouragement from the great principles of the Declaration itself. He believed in the spread of knowledge, commerce, the eventual realization of human brotherhood across the globe, where each returned for evil, good, not blow for blow. This ongoing pursuit of what it truly means to be free and equal, it's not a fixed destination, is it? It's a continuous journey we all continue together, striving for a more perfect, more inclusive union, where the promise of liberty truly applies to everyone. It's a quiet call to action, maybe, for each of us to engage with this complex history, its triumphs and its failures, and contribute to making those self-evident truths a lived reality for all.
We hope this calm dive into U.S. independence has offered you some new insights, perhaps even a sense of quiet wonder as you unwind and reflect on this important day. For more thoughtful explorations and peaceful listening, perfect for unwinding, subscribe to RealTime Affairs wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you for joining us.